introduce our next speaker, Dr. Joe Ricke. And many of you here may know Joe Ricke as the mastermind behind the Inklings Folk Fellowship, a weekly discussion that discusses Tolkien Lewis related topics. If you want to know more about that, I'm sure you can corner him later and in the hallway and find out how to get to be part of the Inklings Folk Fellowship. Joe Ricke is a medieval Renaissance scholar and teacher. His work has been primarily on Shakespeare, early drama, and the Inklings in no particular order of importance. And his most recent publications include several poems in various places, an essay on George MacDonald as a Shakespeare scholar in North Wind, the Journal of George MacDonald Studies, an essay on the new Archangel Fragment Screwtape Letters findings, which is following up on Charlie Starr and Brenton Dickinson's work that will come out later this month. And I have never been able to say this right. It is the C.S. Lewis journal that is named after the concept of joy, and it is the German word, something like Sehnsucht.
Sehnsucht.
Gesundheit. And Joe's long-range project is on the Inklings and performance. Okay, is there anything else I forgot to say, Joe?
Yeah, I just bought a house.
And Joe just bought a house. Congratulations.
Texas, yeah. Okay, Kay may need to help me. So I'm just going to share my
Yep, perfect.
PowerPoint, but at the same time, I need to look at my text. How do I do that, Kay? Is this possible?
When you look at your text, oh, you mean as in to see your notes for the speaker view?
Yeah.
Do you have more than one monitor?
I need to see my paper. How do I share? Okay, so here's share screen and the first slide. I don't know if that's showing yet. But,
yep, we're seeing your slide.
Okay. And if I reduce it, is it reduced to you?
Nope, it still looks good to us.
Oh, you guys can see it. Okay.
Yep, we can see it.
I'm sorry.
Now it caught up. Now it looks a little small to us.
Okay. I've just got so many things open here. Sorry about this.
That's a little better.
Yeah, that's probably my paper. You're seeing now. See if
we're
I'm
still seeing just your PowerPoint.
You do?
Yep. So we see Elrond fade to his call, sort of.
Yeah, and I don't see it, but.
Oh no.
Yeah, hold on. All right.
That's getting better.
Can you see it?
Yep.
All right, that's all. Thanks, everyone. Come join us on Fridays, 4 p.m. Eastern time every week, the Inkling Folk Fellowship. My paper, as of now, is titled Weird Happens, the Affective Dialogical Presentation. And I never heard of affect theory before, but I just threw it in since I just heard Sarah's paper, so I put it into my title. The affect, that's not true. I'm not going to hear any laughter. That's going to be a problem. But the affective dialogical presentation of fate, Providence, and free will, and Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Rings, especially, Fellowship of the Ring. I try not to laugh too loudly when I come across another stuff Tolkien says passage in The Lord of the Rings, you know, the Yoda stuff. And more often in the now encyclopedic, but really they don't even make encyclopediae on this scale, so-called legendarium. Yes, the legendarium, which is to say the Silmarillion, or it is now known the tip of the iceberg, and the lost tales and the found tales, the twice told tales, and the framed tales, and the forgotten tales, and those other ones that will be published like clockwork of the infinite kind in 2022, 2023, 2024, and 2025. Stop me and the Tolkien publishing industry when it all becomes too much. Where was I? Oh, yes. Every once in a while, some character in the Rings will get all worked up and break into Tolkien archaic speak, just enough to make Peter Jackson's eyes moisten and get him all motivated for the next 6-part epic film, Leaf by Niggle. I personally can hardly wait to see the epic digital battle scenes. Apparently, I'm not the only one whose heart is hardened to such linguistic melodrama, because when I was looking for some comments on some of the different words Tolkien uses when talking about fate, free will, providence, fortune, and that mystical music, that gets messed up, but is going to end up being very pretty anyway from the beginning of the Silmarillion, I happened to Google Doom/Tolkien. Now, some of you may have already seen this, but I can honestly say that I'm now going to look up everything that Mr. Coconut Int has ever posted on Tolkien fandom sites. This is his post that caught my eye, ear, and apparently unclean spirit. His riff on, "That is the doom that we must deem." Mr. Coconut Int says, "I confess I found this a little bit yeesh. I expected better from Elrond. It still makes me pause, bemused after so many rereadings of Lord of the Rings. I can imagine Legolas shuddering, Aristor wincing and looking helplessly at Aragorn, who shrugs while Boromir rolls his eyes and Bilbo shakes his head sadly when Elrond says those words. On the other hand, given Charlie Starr's talk this morning, now I can't help thinking the same thing of an Inklings meeting, with the Inklings sitting around when Tolkien first read this passage with Elrond's words, "That is the doom that we must deem." Except I imagine they'd all had too much to drink and they were cheering and saying, "Bravo, Tollers, more of that, more of that. That'll teach old T.S. Eliot." You can read more about it in my forthcoming book, Band or What? Inklings as Enablers. That's a joke. Mr. Coconut Int, a genius, as I've already established, titled his little thread, "Doom Deem, Doom Deem," riffing on the memorable, if bombastic, Moria passage. That's a pun I spent some time on, so I hope you appreciate it, the Moria passage. Another member, Alvin Ariel, who may indeed be Charlie Starr, responded, "Doom Deem makes me think of the great drums of Moria turning out to be bongo drums." Crazy man, far out. And though it has nothing to do with my topic today, somehow the discussion on this particular fandom site turned to puns and Ents. And finally, this. The Ents go marching one by one, haroom, haroom. The Ents go marching one by one, haroom, haroom. The Ents go marching one by one. The little one makes a 4-hour pun. And they all go marching down into the south to defeat Saruman. Thank you. In the few minutes I have left, I want to present some ideas about the way Tolkien speaks about fate, free will, providence, doom, destiny, and such weighty matters in The Lord of the Rings. More precisely, I want to consider the way Tolkien has various characters speak variously about it, the fate cluster I just mentioned before. I suggest that the work, as a literary work, represents a variety of fictional ways of accounting for and explaining this very fraught cluster of fate ideas. After a close look at how that plays out in the Council of Elrond scene, the most dooming of them all, I hope to link Tolkien's representation of the dialogue about fate to his treatment of the same in Anglo-Saxon scholarship, especially in his in-depth discussion of the concept of weird, W-I-R-D, well, Anglo-Saxon word, meaning something like fate, but a lot of other things. A gesture both towards Tolkien's Anglo-Saxon inheritance and more specifically, his Beowulf scholarship. One more clarification, perhaps. Perhaps ideas, when we're talking about fate, providence, free will, and all that, this whole picture, isn't always the most accurate word for the way rational emotional animals, what Malacandrians call Nal, respond to the confusing and baffling realities of what appear in our headlights to be powerful forces out of our control, with at best uncertain intentions, or perhaps worse, no intentions at all. And this experience, as we move into an unknown future as mortals, comes ready mixed with our memories of what we might think of as good and bad luck, and the proverbial wisdom handed down through familial and cultural networks. In other words, fate and this cluster is not just an idea, an abstraction, a theological concept that we deal with. It's something that's in our bellies, and in our genetic history, and in our culture. And it differs from person to person. In our rearview mirrors, we sometimes see or claim to see the evidence of providence. And in the literary work, we might assume that various characters are at different places on their journey and are looking through different windshields at different psychological places on the road. A word about my method. First, I think it's important to think about what kind of beast is Lord of the Rings. Although Tolkien may have worked out his opening music of the Ainur section of the Silmarillion as early as the end of World War I, that seems to be only marginally related to the world of the Lord of the Rings, originally known, after all, as the New Hobbit story, not the working out of the Silmarillion. Perhaps and even his narrator are reconciling that primal mythic vision with what became a prose epic elegy, The Lord of the Rings. In this essay, however, I'm focusing on what the characters of Middle-earth think and say about these issues, because in fact, they seem to think and talk about them a lot. And previous work, I mentioned Verlin Flagger and then something edited by Hostetter on Tolkien and fate, which I will not get into now. Secondly, looking to Tolkien's work as an Anglo-Saxonist for suggestions and for help will be a big part of where I'm headed. As has been well documented, his work in general, and Lord of the Rings specifically, was much influenced by his scholarship and the works he read, taught, and edited. Although a certain Boethian influence may be detected in Tolkien's work in general, Boethius, early, late classical, early medieval philosopher, I'm rather more interested in the literary influences on his literary presentation or expression of providence, fate, and chance. Not that, of course, Boethius was also a literary figure of sorts. Third point here, it so happened that a few years ago, I was in the Bodleian Library at Oxford reading through Tolkien's notes on Beowulf. Now, let me just interrupt myself, something I do a lot, here to say that many of the speakers here today probably wouldn't admit it, but they'd probably agree with me that the life of a poor scholar, most of us dying of consumption, if the coughing in Duke Humphrey's library is any indication of our cumulative health, have very few joys greater than saying things like, a few years ago, I was in the Bodleian Library at Oxford reading through Tolkien's notes on Beowulf. It's almost as good as bidding farewell to the poor folks on the sidewalk as we enter the Radcliffe camera. On the other hand, it was rather a shock when I discovered just a couple of years after reviewing these notes that Christopher Tolkien had repurposed them, or most of them, as something like textual notes to his father's translation of Beowulf, finally published in 2014. I believe that's 86 years after Tolkien actually did the translation. Well, anyway, for me, Christopher Tolkien's work in that, doing that was fortuitous or faithful or fortunate or providential, or I was just deemed lucky. Finally, instead of picking out a few of several hundred relevant passages throughout The Lord of the Rings, which might help us understand what Tolkien was up to, or what the text was up to, even when Tolkien might not have noticed, because I actually believe that everyone has free will except authors. Here, I'm going to focus on one chapter of great importance, which brings together an interesting array of characters, all concerned about their fate, whatever that means, and all or most of all speaking about it in one way or another, and that is the Council of Elrond. The Council of Elrond is the council of the free peoples to determine a number of things, like what to do about Minas Tirith. Now that's Boromir's concern. He cares deeply about that, and he cares about the fate of Minas Tirith. Or how to save the whole dang world. That's Gandalf's concern. But they are especially concerned, and in fact it is, according to Elrond, the doom that must be deemed, what to do about the ring. I'm going to assume right now I don't need to explain about the ring. I don't think you'd be here if you didn't know about the ring. Not even fate could make me explain about the ring. Elrond, speaking about fate as a kind of call, says these things, and they should be on your slide. I'm not seeing any chat, and that's good because it's not distracting me. Obviously, I distract myself enough as it is. But if you are not seeing that, somebody may want to pop up and wave their hands and say that it's not working. Okay. Elrond says, you have done well to come to the company. You will hear today of all that you need in order to understand the purpose of the enemy. There is naught that you can do other than to resist with hope or without it. Sounds very much like the passage Sarah read, Gandalf, later in the work. What shall we do with the ring? That is the doom that we must deem. This is the person you are called hither. Called, I say. Though I had not called you. You have come and are met in this very nick of time, more like it, Elrond, by chance as it may seem. Yet it is not so. Dang you, Elrond. Believe rather that it is so ordered that we who sit here and none others must now find counsel for the peril of the world. Whatever, Elrond affirms they have a purpose, a telos, and they were called, although he's quick to say that he is not the caller, and to suggest that perhaps called is just an expression meaning you have come. If not, why not say who or what has actually called them together? He continues by invoking chance, then undercutting it twice. You have come by chance as it may seem, though it's not, it's so ordered. Then we move to another figurative stab at meaningfulness, not called, but so ordered that just these and no others are met. This may be words of wisdom from a higher, more philosophical being, or just stuff Elrond says, or both. Whatever, it sets the stage and introduces another and important related concept that I won't get into much today, but it is important, I think, belief. The imperative, believe that it is so ordered, actually appears to be a kind of fideistic imperative along the lines of, I don't know, but it's necessary you awake your faith. Shout out Shakespeare there. That does not, it seemed to me, sound like an expression, clear or cloudy, of Tolkien's view of fate, but it might be Tolkien's way of expressing one particular elven view. It would be impossible to go through all the other voices at the council which also invoke and explain and or confuse the issue of fate, providence, and free will, but here are a few specific other passages. Boromir heard a voice, remote but clear, crying, "Seek for the sword that was broken, there shall be shown a token that doom is near at hand." Aragorn to Frodo about the ring, "It has been ordained that you should hold it for a while." To which Gandalf adds solemnly, "Bring out the ring, Frodo, the time has come." In my margin, who says? Following this, Boromir and Aragorn engage in interpretive debate over the meaning of the word doom in the prophecy. Boromir interprets it more fatalistically and personally, and tribally, perhaps, than Aragorn. I say in the slide, they debate more about the meaning of doom than they do about the ring. Boromir interprets it more personally or tribally and more fatalistically. Aragorn interprets it more like something's going to happen and somebody's going to get hurt. The words were not the doom of Minas Tirith, says Aragorn. It's not personal, it's not tribal. But doom and great deeds are at hand. Great deeds, heroic deeds, fighting. I'm interested in the specific view of the specific characters and their different views of fate and doom and this, and I wonder about the truth value of Aragorn's statements here and elsewhere in The Lord of the Rings. First of all, if I've been trying to track something about these characters, and Aragorn seems to be a kind of Marcus Aurelius figure, rather stoic at times, and but do we know he feels a responsibility for the entire mission, for the fellowship, before even there's a fellowship, for the hobbits, for the fate of the world. So he generally says things that I think are also geared towards not sharing, but strengthening the troops, as it were. Bilbo then, as I say, he knows not the doom of fear or the fear of Deem or the color of green. Bilbo then stands up and utters a sort of chant, prophecy riddle thing that he made up. He turns to Frodo at the end, I made that up. So I really don't know what kind of authority it has in the Middle-earth Philosophical Society. But he claims that, among other things, the crownless Aragorn again shall be king. All that glows, gold does not glitter, more Shakespeare. Not all those who wander are lost. The old that is strong does not wither. Deep roots are not reached by the frost. From the ashes a fire shall be woken. A light from the shadows shall spring. Prophecy. Renewed shall be blade that was broken. The crownless again shall be king. I assume Dyson didn't like this, Charlie. I read over this 20 times or so, and before I was looking at this topic this way, I never thought of what the heck is going on here. I mean, this fits in with many ancient riddles, prophecies, proverbs, songs, etc. in the text, but they are usually ancient or elven or both. That's almost seems to be the nature of their truth claim, passed down through all the centuries. This has the ring, of authority, but what claim can Bilbo make to the kind of providential wisdom, even prophecy, it offers? Or is this an example of the way one takes older, riddling, gnomic wisdom and revises it or enhances it, if in a time of existential crisis? Another way that rational, emotional creatures respond. After Gandalf's account of the ring and his capture of Gollum, Boromir asks, "To what doom did you put him?" After Legolas's rather embarrassed admission that the elves had let Gollum escape, Gandalf says he must do what he will. I'd like to talk to Craig Boyd about that one and some of the others. He must do what he will. This necessity. I've always thought this is not obvious if you think about it, although he will do what he must might be. But it does work in my headlights rearview mirror idea. He must do what he will. After he's done it, it'll be fate, providence, or both. We'll wait and let it happen. What he will do, he must do. Another way of putting it sounds very necessitarian. I'm not going to say that's Tolkien's view. It's just something Gandalf says here. Going on, but he may play a part yet that neither he nor Sauron have foreseen. So here we're talking about fate, and we have some foreshadowing by the author. Guess what? Even an eagle deems doom, folks. As an eagle who is not at the council, but is a character in a story Gandalf tells at the council about his encounter with Saruman. An eagle even gets into the doom deeming. When Gandalf asks him if the men of Rohan are still trustworthy, the sage eagle responds that so far so good, but their doom cannot be long delayed. Rational, emotional creatures, including eagles in The Lord of the Rings, think a lot in this difficult time about fate. So I wondered, is this an example of eagle prophecy, eagle intuition, or the way I think of it, an eagle making a reasonable assessment of the situation and saying, it's a hard rain gonna fall, one way or the other. Things are going to happen. And you might say, well, that's a weird way of thinking about fate. Well, wait till we get to Tolkien talking about Beowulf. As the conversation continues and the direness of the situation becomes more and more evident, Gandalf utters some words of wisdom that sound like special knowledge, but on closer inspection, probably are more simply a rational and pastoral assessment of the problem. They also contain a strain of realism or fatalism, like Aragorn's earlier, depending on how seriously we take him. Oops. Apparently, I don't have that slide. He says, it's not our part here. And it's important here, I believe our part is in our role in the play. It's not our part to play. He says, it is not our part here to take thought only for a season or for a few lives of men or for a passing age of the world. We should seek a final end of this menace, even if we do not hope to make one. Craig, of course, I know Sarah's already mentioned hope. Craig writes about Tolkien's being the writer of hope. It's interesting here that we have some of the main characters saying, even if we don't have hope, we're going to do this. Of course, that can be a thing people say to, in Anglo-Saxon work, fight without hope, to spur their warriors on to face the battle. Confused as well we should be, Aristor asks, who will read this riddle for us? Elrond, born for such rhetorical moments, answers, none here can do so, at least none can foretell what will come to pass. Now, I've just heard some foretelling in the passages I've looked at. Maybe not complete foretelling, but there certainly was foretelling. But it's also calling to mind and foreshadowing the many times in Lord of the Rings where people see into the future, but confusingly or only partially, or not what necessarily will happen, but what might happen. But as I was saying, don't the riddle poem that Boromir recited and Bilbo's composition at least claim to foretell what will come to pass? Not the entirety of what will come to pass, but a king will come, a sword will be reforged, and a halfling will stand up. So does Elrond mean that the future can't be foretold, or this particular part of the future, the success or failure of the Middle-earth Alliance, cannot be known? Let's move on. After Frodo was described as if he was awaiting the pronouncement of, quote, some doom that he had long foreseen and vainly hoped might, after all, never be spoken, he volunteers for the mission, as we all know. Elrond, echoing the complexity or double talk of his opening of the council, responds, I think that the task is appointed for you, Frodo. and that if you do not find a way, no one will. So apparently the task is predetermined, but not its success. But it is a heavy burden, so heavy that none could lay it on another. And I would say not even the appointee, if it's appointed for him, but maybe I'm just asking too many questions of Elrond and the text. I do not lay it on you, Elrond says, but if you take it freely, I will say that your choice is right. The Inkling said, more of that, Tollers. In this passage, then, and elsewhere in the Lord of the Rings, characters talk about being called, ordained, appointed, seemingly ruled by chance, foreseen, foretold, ordered, spoken to by authoritative, if enigmatic voices in dream songs, perhaps even in Bilbo poems, and given a part. By whom? And what evidence other than guesses is offered for such ideas, if ideas they are? Perhaps feelings or half doubts, half beliefs is more accurate. How can these characters talk about such things incessantly, but with such ambiguity? The picture I've sketched here does not fit with some of the attempts I've read to deduce a kind of systematic philosophical understanding of fate and fortune and providence in Tolkien. Instead, I argue that we have here a representation of the ways that characters like us, regardless of the amount of hair on our feet or the shape of our ears, respond to the need for hope and courage as the darkness closes in. There is not in the Council of Elrond passage a consistent meaning of doom or fate, or even, sorry to say, a consistent belief in the shadowy presence of some kind of providential power. Boromir is sure he has been spoken to, but he doesn't know what he's been told or who told him. Aragorn hopes against hope, as they say, but it isn't entirely clear whether some of that is not rhetorical due to his position as leader. Elrond's complex or contradictory speeches, however you see them, may boil down to, I don't know much more than you, but I've got language skills out the ears. I never would have deemed this doom on my own, even though I also have excellent language skills and am oftentimes contradictory. It was reading Tolkien's discussion of fate, Anglo-Saxon word weird, especially weird, in the commentary section in the notes section of the Christopher Tolkien's publication of Tolkien's translation of Beowulf. Tolkien's discussion is significant not only for his close attention to the word and meaning of weird, but its many and shifting meanings in Beowulf and elsewhere, and also for his application of how an author like the Beowulf author makes literary and effective meaning. In his commentary on line 376 of Tolkien's translation, 455 in the text of Beowulf, Goth the weird so shall, Tolkien translate, fate goes ever as she must. Tolkien writes, it's a difficult matter to determine in any given passage containing weird how far it was more than grammatically personalized. What precisely it means, that is, how far it had or had retained for speakers or hearers any conscious ingredient of what we may call mytho-philosophical reflection in evidently well-known formulae. Say, in other words, to what degree does it mean something like fortune or God or the devil or anything, except stuff happens for some reason? Sounding somewhat like some of the like a critic of the critics who have written about the equivalent terms in Lord of the Rings, Tolkien writes, the matter of weird only concerns the criticism of Beowulf in particular, as far as is concerned with the theology of the author. And that requires a special disquisition or lecture examining the references to scripture, to heathendom, to God, or to fate in the poem. Anyone who is sufficiently interested in the poem or in the mind and imagination of the period can, of course, do that for himself. And this is a traditional way of going about it. Then he says, I would issue two warnings, obvious, but often neglected. By the way, I should have said something just fantastic about not only Tolkien's work on Beowulf, which is foundational and revolutionary, but the fact that he translated it in 1928 when nobody was paying attention to it really as a literary work. But go on. It is these warnings from Tolkien, he says, but I've got these warnings that we issue 2 warnings. It's these warnings from Tolkien to his hearers, readers, whom he depicts as interested readers of Beowulf, that form the basis of my musings on the degree to which the ways fate, I mean the larger cluster of ideas, or weird, as presented in Lord of the Rings, ever amounted to, or were even intended to amount to, some coherent whole, philosophical, theological stance of the author and or the text. And even if they do amount to something coherent, having isolated and explained that philosophy, have we yet done justice to the dialogical nature of the literary text? So Tolkien's 2 warnings. The first is this. There is a dramatic element in the poem. He's talking about Beowulf. He wrote this in 1928 or so. We're not sure when he wrote the notes. It's most strongly seen in the conception of the characters of Beowulf and Hrothgar in their presentation. It's important to note whether theological expressions occur in a speech by Beowulf, by Hrothgar, or by some other character, or are used by the poet himself addressing his audience directly. The point seems to be not only that readers should make this distinction first before generalizing, but should appreciate the specificity of and difference between the different expression of big and metaphysical ideas like fate as part of the artistry and the effect of the entire work. Not only different characters, but the narrator and perhaps different attitudes within the narrator who may not have a unified consciousness, unless Aristotle is right about everything. In fact, the more literary reading would note this picture of fate as an aspect of the character and the characterization more than an aspect of the author's worldview. This links with Tolkien's discussion of Beowulf as an elegy more than an epic in his The Monster and the Critics, his great work on Beowulf. A little note, side note, Tolkien allows for and cares about performance a lot, I think. Of course, we already heard from Charlie how he liked to perform these for the Inklings, read them out loud, but of course that sometimes got quieted. The as Charlie mentioned, the Anglo-Saxon elegies that Tolkien worked on were, after all, basically dramatic monologues 1,000 years or so before Robert Browning had the good sense to, quote unquote, invent them. This also links it with powerful dramatic speakers whose views on fate are specifically rooted in their existential situations in other Anglo-Saxon works. I mean, especially 3 poems especially dear to J.R.R. Tolkien, other than Beowulf: Wanderer, Seafarer, and the Battle of Maldon. Wanderer, an exile from his homeland and ringlord, depicts fate as brutal and inflexible and counsels his audience to focus instead on Almighty God in heaven. Seafarer sees the harshness of fate as a force perhaps even beneficent, which pushes us to search and to sail towards larger and more ultimate meanings. And in the Battle of Maldon, the great flawed hero, Britnoth, thanks God for his good fortune, even as his free decision, his choice, which prompts Tolkien's famous Oframoda essay attached to the play that he wrote, The Homecoming of Britnoth, results not only in his death, but the unnecessary deaths of his followers at the hands of Viking marauders. Well, I won't have time to unpack any more of this today. Back to Beowulf. Just it's something that Tolkien's very interested in, and a variety of expressions that he's familiar with and that he does scholarship on. His second warning suggests that people talk about fate because it's what people have talked about for a long time. It's something we have words for, ready-made, formulaic words, as it were, even if the words may not be linked with any specific content or meaning any longer, or more likely in Lord of the Rings, at least, with varying degrees of meaning attached. He writes, expressions involving fate, fortune, etc. are at all times liable to become formulae, the content of which has evaporated, or I would say to varying degrees might have evaporated. They become items of colloquial diction. Offhand, you cannot, if a man says fortune favors the brave, which is something Beowulf says once, from that deduce his temper of mind, his beliefs or philosophy, if he has any, or whether he would write fortune with a capital F and has even as a fancy any imagination of a person existing independently of himself in his inherited phrases, turning a wheel or down and fits, turning a wheel up or down and fits a caprice. That's the wheel of fortune, big in Boethius. Tolkien believes, in fact, that this is so much the case that for him, Most of the expressions concerning weird are tautologous, manifestly or verbally concealed, not because people were too stupid to perceive this, but because drawing attention to the inevitable tautology expresses a resigned or fatalistic mood. So the very passages that, well, in other words, lots of doom happens, talk, sorry, this is too small for you to read probably, is rather foreboding, even if it just means that things that are going to happen are going to happen. But it's that flavor, that coloring, that's important. So some of the stuff I identify, I'm not sure makes sense in the Council of Elrond, that basically sounds like, well, something's going to happen. But it's said in a way that sounds fatalistic, or at least colored with a kind of sense of metaphysical and ultimate significance. And in other words, lots of doom happens. Oh, I said that already. Okay, the expression Tolkien says now, "Gotha weird so shall," is hardly more than a grammatical variation of que sera, sera. What will be, will be. In many phrases, weird, grammatically personalized, thus practically functions as a substitute for a passive with unnamed agent. Weird off saves a man if his courage fails not. It basically would mean to the speaker, a man of courage will be saved. In other words, be strong and you got a chance. Or as Okonkwo says in Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, when a man's chi says yes, his spirit says yes. When a man says yes, his chi or his spirit says yes too. In other words, successful people tend to think successfully. So other examples of this, weird happens, he was weirded upon, or weird saves a man means a man of courage, that a man of, if a person shows courage, he will be saved. Tolkien goes on and talks more fully about this, but we'll skip the rest of that now. He does talk more about another word, feia, which is a word for fate, and he basically says it's again sounding like a little bit like Shakespeare, that it seems to be ripeness, or all ready for death, or gone soft, rotten, and that's a word that is often linked with doom or doomed. Anyway, I conclude. Another great medievalist / engineer / novelist, one with his own legendarium, which, unlike Tolkien's, we are invited to laugh, if painfully, at, I mean Kurt Vonnegut, has expressed some of these same ideas in other ready-made meaning pills. Tiger got to hunt, bird got to fly, man got to sit and wonder, why? Tiger got to sleep, bird got to land, man got to tell himself he understand. These are from Cat's Cradle. Alas, perhaps translated as, it may be that he too may have a part to play, as if anyone doesn't, just as Shakespeare. Another word from Vonnegut, so it goes, which I translate as weird does what it wants. Or most famously, perhaps, we do doodly do what we must, muddly must, muddly must. Muddly do, until we bust, bodily bust, bodily bust. I translate that as, there is one doom we must all deem, and no amount of talking will change it. However, to be human, or dwarf, or elf, or hobbit, is to do what we must, which either is or is not the same as what we will. Ultimately, Tolkien's own view of fate, choice, and providence is almost certainly closer to my own than Vonnegut's is. His religious and philosophical views, to some degree rooted in his Catholic faith and colored by his love of Northern paganism and Anglo-Saxon fatalism, were finally providential, it seems to me. Tolkien's, which I embrace. But in his literary masterpiece, Lord of the Rings, whether consciously or unconsciously influenced by his saturation in the Anglo-Saxon texts he loved, studied, taught, translated, edited, and parodied, he allows his flawed, imperfect, and sometimes obnoxious characters to grumble about, sermonize, dream of, curse, hope for, and most importantly, feel the creaturely anxiety we experience when confronting both the difficulty and necessity of making meaning out of the heavy burden laid on all rational, emotional creatures who find themselves placed in fateful circumstances, deeming overwhelming dooms they might not have chosen for themselves. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. That was fabulous. You're definitely going to need to check out the conversation in the chat. So, because there's been all kinds of conversation, including responses to some of your jokes. We do have a lot of questions for this, so I'm not going to be able to get to all of them. So let me pick a few out here. Just a moment. How about this one? Do you think there's a connection between the idea of weird, meaning how the future will unfold, which is unknowable to humans, and the concept of the fates from Greek mythology who weave a tapestry, presumably according to a design or plan of their own, though the mortals who form the threads are unable to see the pattern before they are woven into it?
Yeah. I'm trying to still negotiate my way around my screen because it was so shrunken while I had the two other things open. I'd love to see the chat. Okay. Yeah, I mean, in antiquity, there's like that's a major understanding of fate. And then of course, and that's why I'm saying there's this whole variety of things, because of course fortune then gets more wound up. How do you like that? In the circle of fortune or the wheel of fortune, and so that idea, which and all these other things. But yeah, there is this both the ancients in that particular mythology, but also all of us existentially understand that we can't know our fate. We can, by faith, believe, have certain beliefs about this sort of thing. And even Martin Luther King had to say, I like to believe, I forget what he said, but about the moral arc of the universe. It is like, I think he predicated that with I hope, or I like. Maybe he said, maybe just said I believe it, but by that I assume he means I hope. Because that's one of my go-tos I talk about a lot. It's like, well, I don't know, I'm not looking out there, I'm not sure what the basis for that hope is. But yeah, so the unknown, and I assume that question, which I can't see it because I haven't yet found my question page. But
you should have a tab at the bottom that says Q&A that you can click on. I'm going to go ahead and read the next one.
Go ahead.
It is
thank you for that question, whoever asked it. Sorry, I didn't answer better than I did.
This one's, so naturally in Beowulf, there is an articulation of the providence of God with the fate proposed in Nordic theology. How does this inform Tolkien's portrayal of Aragorn and Mithrandir? How does chance and providence apply to them in light of Beowulf?
Yeah, just go with the first part of it again, Melody. I got the question part.
Naturally in Beowulf, there is an articulation of the providence of God with the fate proposed in Nordic theology. So how does this inform Tolkien's portrayal of Aragorn and Mithrandir? How do chance and providence apply to them in light of Beowulf?
Yeah, well, I think what I'm arguing is here we have a literary expression, and in Beowulf, and Tolkien warns us against saying, okay, first of all, for those who don't know Beowulf a little better than some, let me just say, in Beowulf, it almost certainly, most scholarship would agree, is a pagan story, predating Christianity. It it's a text that's found in England, but it's set pre-England. And then, so the question is, to what degree is there this Christian overlay on the pagan stories, and how integrated is that? And there seem to be times where clearly it's not very well integrated. And Tolkien kind of does a totally different turn on that, and saying, well, it's got this whole variety of perspectives. And so you have to not judge it and say, oh, it's poorly integrated. He doesn't use that term, but others have. But say, well, make these distinctions about which of the perspectives is showing up. Is it Beowulf's perspective? Is it Hrothgar's perspective, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess what I'm most interested in, and I really appreciate this question, but what I'm most interested in is, what does Aragorn say about fate? And what does Gandalf say about fate? And how do things like Aragorn's, and I was trying to track these and I'm not right there yet, but Elrond's sort of prophetic, Gandalf the sage, Aragorn the somewhat stoic leader. And so he talks about fate in a certain way. Yeah, in Beowulf, Beowulf character says things about fate that seem to sound like strong man. Fate is with the strong man, and I'm a strong man, but the idea of doom, also related concept, which is overall, I think both this, responding to this question, Gandalf and Aragorn especially are the ones who kind of say, and I think it links a little bit with what Sarah said, and also with what Craig's perspective is, like, what's important here is doing the right thing. We fight the darkness, do it the right way, with the Alliance of Free Peoples. We may go down. They both, I mean, Gandalf says the things, right? He's the one who seems to see glimpses. They both do to some degree, but Gandalf says, no, there may be a light at the end of this darkness. But at other times he says, to some degree, we fight without hope, but we fight because we're